Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for joining this session. I see that we have 63 participants on the line, which is really great. To introduce myself, my name's Andrew McCusker, and I'm the head of the Education Finance program at Opportunity International. The purpose of today's session is to explore some alternative sources of financing that may be out there to fund the global education deficit. And so we've put together a great panel today to cover some various aspects of some potential solutions, hopefully covering the global education deficit and the funding gap, and then to explore some specific alternative sources of financing. Many of you on the call will be aware that the funding gap is large and it's increased over the last couple of years as a result of COVID. In addition to that, we're seeing increased demand for access to education on the back of increasing school-age populations in many markets. And yet in many of the countries that we're focusing on, we already see high rates of public education spend. So the purpose of this session is really designed to explore some of the potential other sources of capital out there that can come alongside of public funding to close this education funding gap. What we thought we could do to kick off this session is to start with an icebreaker to learn a little bit about who may be in the virtual room with us today. And so, Carrie, maybe I'll ask you to share the first polling question. For those of you who are new to Zoom or new to Zoom polling, it will effectively be a question that will pop up onto your screen, and it will ask you to respond to it by selecting one of the responses. And so here we're asking, which of the following reasons best describes why you have joined this session today? Either you're potentially a funder of education. Secondly, you may be responsible for education delivery. Or thirdly, potentially not responsible or involved in either the funding or the provision, but are interested in this topic. And so maybe we'll just pause for a minute or two just for the responses to come in. Perfect. Thank you to everyone who voted. And so we can see here that a majority of those in the room are not directly involved in funding or the provision of education, but are interested in the topic. So thank you all for joining. Secondly, we have a bucket of people, about a quarter of participants on the call that are responsible for providing quality education. Thank you again for joining. And about 15% of us are funders of the education system. And so with that, perhaps what I'll do is just invite you all to answer or pop any questions that you have throughout this session into the Zoom chat panel. And what we'll do as we move through the session is direct those to the panelists who may be best placed to answer them for you. If we don't get to any of your questions throughout this session, realizing that we just have an hour, we will come back to you via email with a response to the question, and we can potentially arrange for a time to cover that. And so what I'd like to do is to introduce the keynote speaker for today's event, Liesbet Steer. For those of you who haven't met Liesbet, she's the director of the Education Commission, which is chaired by the former UK Prime Minister, Gordon Brown. And through this role, she was the Commission Director of the report, The Learning Generation, Investing in Education for a Changing World. And so we're hopeful today that Liesbet can talk us through the findings of this report, as well as her experiences through the Education Commission, and really set the scene for our conversation today. Liesbet, welcome to the event, and delighted to hand over the microphone to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for putting this important event together today. It's a real honor for me to be here. And the question you're asking here in this panel is a really important one, and one that we all have thought about a lot, including Justin here, who actually was part of the Education Commission when we released the report as well, knows it very well as well. But maybe to start thinking about the problem we're addressing today, there's one question that actually has continued to puzzle me, and I think it puzzles all of us. And that is that if you go to any country in the world and ask people what's the most important influence on their future, the answer is education. And we've done so many surveys, including the UN, which has confirmed this. So education is the real priority. But then when we look at investments in education, they are often not in line with this prioritization. So the question is, why do we find ourselves so short of the necessary funding for education? If we believe that education is so critical for our future and the future of our children and the recovery of the pandemic, from the pandemic, by the way, we need to make a much stronger case for investments in education, but also related to that, take a much harder look at innovative solutions to address resource scarcity. And that was one of the key messages of the Learning Generation report, as well as other reports that we've been responsible for since then, including the Save Our Future white paper, which was released last year in response to the pandemic. So the key thing here is that pre-COVID, we already struggled to fund education and make the case for investment alongside other priorities like health and climate. And now we're in a COVID or post-COVID era where this has become even more difficult. And I don't know to what extent people on the line are familiar with these numbers, but a review of education financing earlier this year showed that because of COVID, likely 2/3 of the poorest countries are going to reduce their national education budgets. And that reduction in budget will be particularly problematic for inequities, because we already knew, and that's also one of the findings of the Commission, that 10% of resources is reaching the poorest 20% versus 40% of all resources are reaching the 20% richest children. So there's a huge skewing in the expenditure, and if that budget gets cut even further, we have even greater inequities. And on top of that, we now see that households are spending less because they are going through economic hardships, and that is also affecting our ability to invest. And then finally, to top it all off, we have the donors cutting back, where estimates have shown that we could lose about $2 billion compared to the sort of pre-pandemic high levels. So there are out there a lot of estimates of the funding gap, and they kind of vary, but even the kind of conservative estimates place the gap at around 75 billion, and Justin will explain this because he's just done a great report clarifying this gap. And that already includes some very optimistic assumptions around government and household spending. UNESCO actually places this gap even bigger. So, but whatever this external funding gap is, what's really clear is that the budget that we have right now to fill that gap, which consists of ODA of about 16 billion, and recently, actually, I checked my last check of the OECD DAC aid from private donors is now at about 600 million. At least that's the recorded amount, compared to 8.5 billion in total. So it's only 7%. So tiny amounts compared to the total gap. So what we know is that we will need to innovate. I will need to get everybody involved. And so what the Commission said was governments need to step up their investments to increase mobilization of domestic resources, prioritization of education, and through better spending. We said that international aid needs to increase, and that is now a really problematic issue in the current context, and that it should be at least 15%. And that obviously includes also we need to replenish GPE. We're all here this week because of that. But none of this, even if we do all that, we still don't have enough. And at the very best, we can maybe close a quarter of that gap we were talking about, or a third, depending on how big it is. So we need to think about new solutions, and that needs to bring in the private sector and the public sector. And it will need us all to come together in new ways and to work together in ways that we just haven't been used to. So to set the scene a little bit for the conversation, I've come up with 5 key questions that we should try and answer today, which could help us come to maybe some of these solutions in terms of the additional investments. So the first question is, what are the promising examples that exist out there, and what can we actually learn from other sectors, and what is ready to be operationalized? We've done some reviews actually of financing in other sectors recently, and what we found is that there is a much greater awareness there of the different instruments that are out there, and which instruments show the most promise for specific needs, which ones can provide direct and immediate new funding, and which ones will take longer to develop. We actually lack a framework like that, or a serious comparison of various innovative instruments in terms of their leverage potential, expected cost to donors, types of instruments, is it debt versus grants, what's the potential to be restructured, how close are they to market, etc., etc. So we actually, Justin's playbook that he will talk about is a big step in that direction, because he actually did look, and his team looked at the sort of big global funds out there and made that kind of comparison in terms of added value, leverage capacity, and cost to donors. But there are many other instruments out there that are very innovative, that include the private sector as well, that we need to look at again. We did some of that at the time of the commission, when we produced a report. We actually did a mapping of about 18 instruments. And one of the recommendations that came out of that review is for the International Finance Facility for Education. And the International Finance Facility for Education is actually an interesting instrument because it provides public funding, but it mobilizes private capital. It uses official donor guarantees in a totally new way to unlock private capital or private financing from capital markets through the multilateral development banks. And the multilateral development banks have this great ability to mobilize funding from capital markets and then turn it into public financing, which is kind of a real sort of trick that they have up their sleeves, because they're a bank. They issue bonds, they get the money, and then they on-lend it to countries. So if it has designed an instrument that really captures that capacity of the NDBs by using this guarantee scheme, and we know that this could unleash billions of dollars and give countries affordable money for education. But if it has not been realized, and that's a real shame, and we think it should be, and maybe I'll leave it to others to assess kind of how, compared to other examples out there, how it features. There are actually a number of other things out there that I've come across recently. I've recently been in contact with a group of private philanthropists and high net worth individuals and sort of private equity funds who are trying to get philanthropic money into charitable organizations in a very new and innovative way. We haven't seen much of that either. Has happened more in other sectors as well. So we should be having more promising examples and try to map them. That's point number one. Second question, we need to answer who can do what. So who can do what in all of this? There's a need for greater clarity around how different actors can contribute to filling the financing gap, because that would help clarifying what could be funded publicly and what can be funded privately. When we did the Education Commission report, we came up with this concept of progressive universalism, where we said that public resources need to be invested in a way that prioritizes the lower levels of education and the most marginalized, the poorest. So prioritize with public finance, early childhood education, early learning. That's why some of us have been working so hard on that agenda as well. To try and get more public funding into early learning. Last year, we highlighted these points again in the Save Our Future campaign in terms of public funding, raise it through prioritizing it within recovery packages, and then spend it in a way that really has this prioritization and this progressive universalism. But then again, we need to recognize that governments can't fill the gap completely, and that others will need to step in, whether they're philanthropists, private sector, donors, or households themselves. So there's a number of questions that we need to ask ourselves about, okay, if that remaining gap needs to be filled by the private sector, how do we get them involved? How do we get private philanthropists involved in these new solutions? How could we incentivize them and have them engaged in unlocking bigger resources of finance? For example, blending their money with loan finance or providing guarantees. Same with private financiers who can put up money for impact investments, perhaps for student finance and so on. We really need to look at all those options. And then obviously the official donors, where do they fit in? And should they just use their grants to just put them straight into grant giving, which is great in low income countries, or should they combine their money and leverage it to have sort of bigger pots of money, which is kind of the whole idea of IFED. And then finally, household spending. We cannot deny that households will spend on education, but we need to figure out what is the appropriate way for them to spend and how do we capture that. The third question is about an attitudinal issue. So how can we change the attitude in the sector when it comes to engaging the private sector in education financing? I recently wrote a piece asking the question why in climate it has been so much more, where the sector has been so much more successful at mobilizing action and getting greater investment in the sector. And one of the key conclusions is actually that the corporate sector has played a big role in this. Because many of the forward-leaning international corporations now recognize that the importance of climate is really important for their bottom line, and they've been responsible not only for setting their own targets, but also actually leaning on national governments to invest. So where are the private companies that are leaning on national governments to invest in education? I think we could learn a lot from that. So how could we as a sector adopt a less adversarial approach, a more positive, open and solutions-driven approach to challenges? My co-author and I conclude that education has not successfully tapped into innovative financing solutions, and that the attitude of some key organizations towards major stakeholders, such as private sector or the multilateral development banks, has been very damaging, and it's a question that we need to address. So how could we actually have a much more grown-up conversation between the private actors and the public sector to talk about this? Because private corporations are totally dependent on educated workforce, and they have expressed interest in engaging, but often they are kept at bay. And that's primarily due to the fact that we confuse the conversation around private financing with conversation around private education, and that needs to be disentangled, and we need to look at that in a separate way and a much more analytical way. So how could we do that in a way that has happened in other sectors and is now really seeing the private actors as part of the solution? We don't have that yet. The fourth question we need to answer is how we can create a culture of impact. Again, really important to engage private actors, and the donors and anybody else is really about this impact piece, and creating a culture of R&D and mobilizing actors around evidence and evidence-based policy. Again, if I take an example from climate, there is an initiative called the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, which brings together 70 institutions in government, development finance, philanthropy, and the private sector. And this initiative, public-private, drives billions of dollars to climate mitigation and adaptation in developing countries by kind of looking at promising ideas and then really thinking about how these ideas could be scaled, identify, develop, pilot them, and scale them. And this group has been quite successful at using small amounts of money and multiplying them in ways that we haven't. And through a combination of different types of finance, whether it's grants or it's debt or it's equity, et cetera, et cetera. Where is that kind of initiative in education? Could we create that? And it has to be really driven by that impact piece. And then finally, I would say the final question is around how we better coordinate and bring these different actors together in whatever platform is appropriate. I think we need to create new spaces to bring actors together because the sector, as you know, has been very fragmented. And when we've come together, we've often come together with our peers. For example, in the Commission, we do have the Global Education Forum that brings together bilateral and multilateral donors, but we know that's not enough. That's the public and the sort of official donors. We need to bring others into this. So we are organizing our work there around these priority areas of health and nutrition, foundational learning, digital learning, and the education workforce. It would be really great to get the private sector, private philanthropists, and so on, to also start thinking at these around these same priorities and how they could add value. So having this multi-sector approach is something we still are trying to figure out. I think some examples, obviously, we have the Global Business Coalition as a great example of bringing businesses together. Generation Unlimited is bringing together public and private around digital learning. I know Suzanne has been doing some work on trying to create communities of practice that are also mixed. But we need a lot more of this. And the question is, how do we create it? How do we create a language to talk to each other and understand each other and not get into ideological fights? So I'd say there's no time to waste. Let's answer these 5 questions. Maybe the panelists, they will have a great time with this. We are just completely continuing our work at the Commission and really encourage anybody who wants to know more about some of what I've mentioned to get in touch. And thank you so much for organizing this great conversation. I look forward to hearing the panel and the questions of the audience.
Thank you so much, Liesbet. That's a pretty aggressive agenda, if you like, for the remaining 37 minutes. I'm sure the panelists are up for it. And so maybe what we'll do is introduce the panel and move into their part of the presentation. I can see 3 open questions in the Q&A section, some great questions there. And so please keep them coming through. And perhaps what I will do is address those to the panelists is in turn as we move through the presentation. And so with that, maybe what I'll do is introduce the 3 remaining panelists. And so firstly, we have Justin Van Fleet from Their World and the Global Business Coalition for Education. So Justin's the president of global children's charity Their World and the executive director of the Global Business Coalition for Education. And through his work there, he's authored the paper, the Education Finance Playbook, which is a practical guide for governments, donors, and philanthropists to fund quality, inclusive education for all by 2030. Secondly, we have Suzanne Lee from USAID. So Suzanne is the education finance specialist from the Center for Education in the Democracy, Development and Innovation Bureau. And in this role, Suzanne provides a strategic education finance guidance to USAID's $1 billion education finance portfolio, and in specifically in regard to their public-private partnerships, the public financial management, and the innovative financing mechanisms to fund the education policy aims. And thirdly, to Scott Sheridan, who is the Operations Director at Opportunity International. And so Scott is responsible for the operations and business intelligence function of the global footprint and has authored the report on the $24 billion opportunity, which estimates the demand for local private financing for low-cost schooling in low and middle income countries. And so maybe with that, what I'll do is hand over to Justin. Justin, Liesbet provided you a little bit of an introduction into your work and set out effectively 5 questions in her work. I'm very interested to hear from you about the roadmap that you see going forward from this large financing gap that we see now, which Liesbet has pointed out is shrinking, at least from the public side, and what you think we can practically do about trying to attract more private financing to this deficit.
Great, thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the introduction. Right, I think when we look at the challenge before us, it's shocking to me. We're at a moment in history where every single child around the world has had their education interrupted, whether you're in a high-income country or low-income country. you know what it's like to not have that school to go to, and where education should be a top policy agenda if we're looking at recovery efforts. It's an absolute no-brainer. If we're trying to build human capacity, help people reach their potential, we need to be investing in education. We want to be creating jobs, innovating. If we want parents to be able to enter the workforce, having early childhood education centers for their children to go to is imperative. And so this is the time in a global recovery when we're trying to stimulate economies where we need to be investing in education, and we're just not seeing that. We're seeing domestic revenue at lower rates because of lower tax and income that's being generated in domestic budgets. We're seeing the international community pulling back and retreating from their global obligations of supporting human rights and the right to education. And it's a really trying time, and I think it at times defies logic where we invest our resources. Our education finance playbook was really trying to take stock of all of the work that's out there, that all of the incredible institutions, whether it's a UN agency or NGOs and other academics have done, and just trying to pull it together in a really concise roadmap, as you said, and sort of taking stock of where we're at and how do we go forward. Because the first question we always get, or that people always say, is education is so confusing. There's so many actors and it's really difficult to understand. And what we did is we drew a map. We drew a picture, and and it looks very similar to every other sector where you have UN agencies and NGOs and development banks all working together. And then you have specialized funds that are there, like GP, like Education Cannot Wait, like the proposed finance facility, that are there to supercharge these actors to help them prioritize and create finance to help support countries. And when you look at the roadmap of how do we fund education, first and foremost, the priority needs to be in countries themselves, helping to maximize domestic revenue, helping countries invest more in education, whether that means prioritizing it within domestic budgets, whether it means closing tax loopholes, whether it means tax reform. That's where we really need to invest. When we look at the commission report, I mean, it seems weird to talk about the commission report because it was 5 years ago when we did that research, and I think the numbers are a bit more optimistic than they are today, given all that's happened with the pandemic. At that point in time, we thought that was about 97% of budgets, where it's probably a bit less today. If we got all of that right, you could really be funding education. The problem is that 3% represents the poorest and most marginalized people on the planet. That 3% that's missing in some countries is 50% of the education budget, which needs to come from external sources, or otherwise half of your education system is not funded. So it might seem small when people say, oh, it's just an extra 3%. But if you're the poorest child on the planet, that 3% is what means the difference between getting an education or not. If you're one of the lowest income countries on the planet, it means half of all young people not having an opportunity. So we need to get both of these right and work both of them side by side. And so that's really where we need to mobilize this amount. And so what is that amount? And Liesbet pointed out, aid reached this high moment of 16 billion just before the pandemic. We looked at some of those projections towards 2030 that we had done in the commission. We looked at UNESCO and the white paper that Liesbet worked on, and those estimates where they put together the costs, the additional costs of education given the pandemic, plus the decrease in domestic revenues. And we're estimating that the minimum amount needed, there's much higher projections out there, is $75 billion a year beyond maximizing domestic revenues. So $75 billion equals millions and millions of children whose education's at stake. And when you look at the 16 billion we have, that leaves $59 billion that's still out there. So even if we get countries to move toward 0.7, which if we look at what the UK is doing, I know they're hosting this conference today, but you have to address the elephant in the room. At the same time they're hosting this and helping us replenish them with GPE, they're also slashing their aid budget by billions of dollars. That's just the fact. And so we're seeing this across the board. So how do we keep pushing towards a 0.7? How do we make sure that education is at least 15% of those aid budgets? And with that, there's still a huge gap. And that's where this issue of innovation comes in, looking at new sources. How do we uphold human rights standards and at the same time find new sources of finance that helps countries deliver on these domestic plans? The proposals we had with the finance facility is one of those. And with the new estimates around that, aid can go 27 times further there is a 27 times leverage ratio on the amount that's put into a cash guarantee through that innovative finance mechanism. And if we're trying to multiply current aid by 5 times, we really need to be looking at all these different options. And not that one's relevant for all countries, but bringing these together can help fill in that piece for the millions of kids that are missing out, incentivize additional domestic finance, because that's also this part of this remaining international support, is how do you actually help governments prioritize this, make the policies and get these programs in place that need the funding so we can deliver on the SDGs. And so that's the quick overview from my perspective. It's also, I have to do this final plug, which is it's where we put the money. We've mentioned early years, 90% of a child's brain develops before the age of 5. We did a report last week, our education scorecard on the early years with Pauline Rose at University of Cambridge, and it shows that aid to the early years has doubled in the past 2 years, but it is still less than 1% of all education aid goes to pre-primary education. And that's a scandal. That's an absolute scandal. And so part of that is making sure that we're investing in the right things. Otherwise, we're leaving almost 200 million kids behind today that are never going to get on track. For all, people talk about foundational learning, skills for the future, bringing in the other pieces around health and nutrition. If these young people aren't even starting in school at these early ages and getting the support they need for their own development, we're really running a risk as we look towards the future. So I'll pause there.
Justin, that's probably a great time to pause. I've just been following the Q&A, and there are 7 questions here, and probably 5 or 6 of them are on a relatively similar topic, and probably addressed to the comments that you have made and those that Liesbet made a little bit earlier on. A large chunk of the financing gap can be filled by public spending, and both you and Liesbet have mentioned this need to effectively try to do everything that we can to bring in more of that funding. Do you have any guidance for us and those on the call as to how we can try to incentivize greater share of public spending into education and potentially even greater tax capture to increase the size of the funding pool?
In terms of domestic budgets?
Correct, yes.
Well, I think there's a huge call for public demand. There's a huge call for individuals and civil society to stand up. In their world, we have our global youth ambassadors. We're at 1,000. We're going to have 2,000 by the end of this year. And they're young people in countries around the world campaigning for education. And these are young people that are going to their own local governments, their own domestic, their own national governments, and campaigning for education spending. We're partnering with organizations in Kenya, where last week we were on Good Morning Kenya talking about the need to invest the government budgets in pre-primary education and allocating the money and reforming tax to be able to do that. And so I think that's the piece that really is up to people. It is really up to people creating the public demand and the public pressure to generate that revenue and to invest it in education. I think that's the number one thing that can sway and change the way that we're funding social services. And as long as we're complacent, as long as people aren't standing up and they're not speaking out, we're going to go through a moment in history where every child's been forced out of school because of a pandemic. And we're going to be going back to more of the same, actually less of the same, on the way we're currently looking at how we're prioritizing education. So we really need people to get out there and to make this a priority.
Thanks, Justin. I didn't realize that work was going on, but that's really cool. We'll have to keep an eye out for that with the youth ambassadors and the role that they are playing. Suzanne, perhaps at this stage, I can introduce you to the panel and just ask you to talk a little bit about USAID's perspective on these different sources of funding that are potentially out there to address the education deficit. Effectively looking at questions 1 and 2 that Liesbet proposed to us, for example, the formative examples that are out there about ways that we can fund this deficit and how these different actors can contribute to filling the financing gap.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. So let me try doing this. So what is USAID's approach to address the education finance gap. And I want to first just say that USAID is first committed to improving learning outcomes and expanding access to quality education for all children and youth. And just to underline the all, we don't distinguish, and particularly for those who are marginalized and underserved. This is an ambitious vision, and no single intervention, policy change, investment, approach, or method is sufficient to achieve it, as indicated both by Liesbet and Justin's presentation. USAID focuses much of its work on strengthening education systems in partner countries in line with their unique needs and contexts. The vast majority of this work is directed toward public education systems. However, we recognized, as Liesbet and Justin's presentation indicated, that the public finance is not sufficient. And we recognize that affordable non-state schools, including not-for-profit, for-profit, faith-based, and community schools, can play an important role in education provision, especially in conflict and crisis contexts. So this is for two primary reasons. First, non-state schools already account for a significant proportion of enrollment in partner countries, particularly in conflict and crisis countries. And secondly, there is nearly a huge gap in financing for education in low and middle income countries. The vast majority of this gap will not be made up by donors, but rather must be expanded through domestic resource mobilization and expanded private sector investment. Not engaging with non-state schools would mean missing out on a tremendous opportunity and would result in not reaching large swaths of school-age populations in partner countries. Our field staff need the flexibility to engage with a diverse set of partners to meet the unique needs of each country. And each partner will continue to be held to the same level of accountability, transparency, and quality. So how does USAID mobilize? Let's say we do public financing by working with the governments, but we recognize that our own funds are relatively small compared to the government funds and household funds, which USAID has defined as private finance. Unlike the health sector, about 4%, USAID also recognizes that blended finance using public funds to catalyze private funds models were limited, less than 1%. In addition, the Development Finance Corporation was established, the first USG development finance institution, and a growing number of social impact investors were interested in making investments in education. So in our 2018 USAID education policy takes a forward-leaning approach on innovative finance and with non-state actors. USAID policy states that with the support of the government, that it will engage with non-state actors and promote finance and delivery innovations to expand access to quality education. So with this mandate, USAID launched a blended finance education activity called Catalyze Edu Finance in October 2019 to help close the financing gap. It is a $27.5 million 5-year program that develops partnerships to facilitate innovations in financing and service delivery that increases access to low-cost quality education for the underserved and disadvantaged communities. All of Catalyze Edu Finance activities apply the following guardrails. All of its achievements must achieve measurable educational outcomes, such as increased equitable access, improving learning outcomes. All projects will focus on low and low middle income populations and communities. When funding is provided for schools, funding will predominantly go to locally owned, socially motivated schools that prioritize increasing access and improving measurable outcomes for the poor and are not primarily driven by commercial motivations. And last guardrail that we have on all of these activities is that each host country government will be in agreement with the approach proposed and the funded activities. The Catalyze Edu Finance program identifies, tests, and refines and scales a pipeline of education investments in several countries in Africa and in Latin America, Caribbean region. We're trying to test it out to see that we could do it responsibly, how we could effectively mobilize more private finance for low-income communities and leveraging local resources that's already happening on the ground to help leverage more of those funds to use it more productively. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. And I'm delighted that you did speak a little bit about the public-private partnerships and the opportunity that may exist there for financing some of this gap, because that has come up in the question and answer answers as well. Suzanne, in terms of the Catalyze work, I'm delighted that you brought that up. It's obviously something that we've been delighted to see and have been working on in together over the last few years. Liesbet mentioned a little bit about the need for building a stronger community of experts. Can you talk a little bit about USAID's objectives and work in that, and how you think the people on the call may be able to be involved in that?
Yeah, thank you for that, Andrew. Yeah, as Liesbet indicated, I think the education sector is a little bit more nascent compared to, let's say, the climate sector or let's say the health sector in terms of bringing together all the various actors, and maybe it's more of an attitude change on not seeing the private sector or others more adversarial, but really bringing everyone together and to kind of have more of a listening attitude to really with the whole objective of bringing all children to receive a quality education. And on that note, we realized in order to do that, we've at USAID under Catalyze Edu Finance is establishing a community of practice. And again, instead of it being an ideological debate, that it's really based on evidence. So we're hoping soon, we just awarded to someone who's going to help facilitate this community of practice, bring in both the donors, the private sector, and most importantly, actually, the voices on the ground, the host country governments, and actually parents associations and school associations, and to bring them and to talk about different, and also bring in the researchers, the academics, and to see what works and what doesn't work and what's most effective for the countries that we're serving. So if you're interested in this community of practice, please reach out. I'll put it in the chat box where you could go to the link and they will direct you on how you can register. But we will soon be through this community practice. We're hoping to have forms of different conversations, evidence that is shared, and and some learning agendas that's put forth, and also maybe different activities that can be and resources that can be innovatively used. So over to you, Andrew. I'm going to put that into the chat box.
Perfect. Thanks, Suzanne. And we will do the same and collect that list for you as we move through the call. And so thank you for everyone who's been posting questions into the Q&A. We'll continue to direct them to the panelists. Perhaps at this stage, we'll introduce the last of the three panelists, Scott Sheridan from Opportunity International's Education Finance Program. And so Scott's in charge of effectively collecting the data to understand a little bit about the size of the local financing opportunity domestically from the private sector in terms of funding educational opportunities. And so Scott, last year you published a research piece that was suggesting that the financing demand from local private financing sources is in the tens of billions of dollars in low and middle income countries. I'm interested to learn a little bit more about how this might work in practice. And I think if you can share some of that, we'll come back to you with a couple of questions from the panel after that.
That's great. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so in our report, we found that this gap in domestic markets is being driven by both strong population growth as well as a slowdown in the decline of out-of-school children, and the fact that in low and middle income markets, you have a state sector or a government sector that is already spending over 15% of their total budgets, or roughly 4% of their GDP on education. So it's in our report, what we found is that it's very difficult to imagine governments being able to deploy enough capital to meet the absolute demand that there is for education. In practice, what we do at Opportunity Edu Finance is that we meet with financial institutions and we highlight the deficit that the education sector is facing in their own markets. We work with those financial institutions to assess the market opportunity that exists in their own context. We conduct market research assessments in their specific geography, and we work with them to develop financial products that are tailored and suited for their markets. This gives them the confidence to lend and attract local private capital that can help alleviate the financing gap. We're starting to see a very encouraging trend in this, with an increasing number of local financial institutions who are and microfinance institutions who are recognizing the investment opportunities in their local education sectors.
Scott, interested to hear about that. Potentially some on the call may be interested to learn a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of the trends of local financial institutions being willing to lend to the education sector. Over the last few years, as we've started to see increasing school-age populations, increasing parent demand for non-state school sectors, but also interested to hear a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of the impact of COVID on the willingness of lenders to lend.
Yeah, well, so the impact of COVID has obviously had a strong effect on both households' incomes as well as school incomes. We've seen over, at the very beginning of the pandemic, there was a strong reluctance of financial institutions to continue lending, but in recent months, barring several countries where there are continued lockdowns, we have seen that confidence kind of start to pick up again. We've seen a lot of interest as we kind of go and we conduct roadshows and we meet with financial institutions. We've seen a lot of interest pick up from those financial institutions to address the need, and they are recognizing this gap that all of the previous panelists have mentioned before.
Thanks, Scott. Maybe what I'll do is pick up one of the questions that I'm seeing on the panel and perhaps address that to Liesbet, Justin, and Suzanne. One of the participants has suggested development impact bonds as a potential way that we could take something that's working for other sectors and bring that into the education sector. I wonder if either of you have had any direct experience in working with development impact bonds or any views on this funding mechanism as one of the potential vehicles that we can use to close the financing gap.
Yeah, maybe I could answer at USAID. So USAID has funded some development impact bonds, not in the education sector, but in other sectors, in the health sector. And of course, at USAID, we've done a review on what the lessons learned has been on the development impact bonds in the education sector. And when you see it, there's one kind of a seminal report that Emily Gustafson out of the Brookings Institution, who works on education impact bonds as well as impact bonds, but specifically in the education sector. And what we observed, the impact bonds, the evidence shows that it doesn't really crowd in a lot of resources. What it's really good at doing is showing results, impact. So and measuring impact, and it's good at it crowds in some resources, but not a lot. Not in the traditional sense of what a bond really does. It's more of a performance-based type of mechanism that it really, what its strength is that it really allows you to put a dollar amount on the measurement, have clear indicators and measurements of what you want to achieve. And it really helps if you're looking for an organization that's already proven themselves and you want to scale it up. So, and so that's where it's been proven effective. But in terms of crowding resources, that's not what the evidence didn't seem to bear, that it's not a mechanism to crowd in a large amount of resources. Crowd in some, but not a large.
Thanks, Suzanne. Justin or Liesbet, have you had any experience with development impact bonds that you would like to add to Suzanne's comments?
I'll defer to the others in the panel that probably have more experience than I do.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there is, we have had some experience, and actually the Education Outcomes Fund is one of those mechanisms that has looked at impact bonds and how to make them more kind of streamlined. But I think when we evaluate all these things, that's what my first point was making, that we need to think about the ease and the transaction costs in all of this. So which when we make an assessment and we put all these instruments next to each other, that needs to be one of the things. They are great instruments, but at this stage they're not going to massively scale money because they are still too difficult. We're still trying to figure out the mechanisms and so on. But there are other innovative instruments that are really ready to go and that use existing mechanisms that really are very simple to get off the ground. And I think looking at kind of this timeline, the close to market and the sort of scale of things is really important, I think, when we assess all of these mechanisms.
Thank you for those comments, Liesbet and Suzanne. Liesbet, there was one question specifically for you and the Education Commission on what you will actually fund. In that, do you actually provide direct grants to providers of education or only work through governments and policymakers?
You mean the Education Commission?
Correct, it's a question.
No,
from
we don't have money to hand out. We are thinkers and influencers. We try to bring people together. We have this. We work on analysis, action on the ground, and amplification. And so we would love it if someone could give resources to the people who need it, including the Education Commission.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who's posted questions throughout this event. I think we've got through about half of them. As promised, what we will do is we will take a record of them and then respond to each of you in writing or some other form to the questions that we haven't got to. I realize that there's a few minutes left to round out the hour. And so what I've diligently been doing is taking some notes of some of the high points that some of our panelists have shared over the last 50 minutes. And so what I thought I could do is recap on some of that. Let's see. And so effectively, some of the things that at least I found interesting from the conversation today and had learnt, I was very surprised to hear the magnitude to which public funding is likely to reduce for education, or domestic public funding is likely to reduce following COVID in particular. Liesbet, that statistic that I think you said about 2/3 of governments are likely to reduce funding was pretty alarming to me. In addition, I was interested to hear about the big skew of where the spending is focused at the moment. I think from a number of questions that we've had in the panel and some of the comments that both Liesbet and Justin and Suzanne made, a significant financing burden is going to need to be borne in terms of domestic public spending to close this gap. But I guess the big challenge that a number of you have outlined is how are we actually going to do this in practice. It was interesting to hear, Justin, from you some of the examples about the youth ambassadors as potentially being one way that we can do that and really put pressure on domestic governments to increase their public spending. But I guess we need to spend a little bit more time thinking about that and action in that. Suzanne, I'm very interested to hear about some of the variety of channels to which USAID focuses on funding the education deficit, considering both public and private financing, which funds both state and non-state education systems, and delighted to have you on the panel to talk a little bit about that. A lot of the questions, interestingly, were on some of the innovative financing mechanisms that are out there. Scott, thank you for bringing up the case study of the local bank capital and the leverage that can play. Suzanne, I was also interested to hear your comments too about development impact bonds, and though while they might be helpful, potentially aren't the solution that we need right now to attract large amounts of private funding into the sector. Perhaps on that, I'm very happy to open to Liesbet, Justin, Suzanne, or Scott for any final remarks or answers to any of these kind of open questions that we have before we sign off.
Yeah, I might add one more comment also, because I know some people in the chat, and I think David is here on his making the case for sort of working on tax havens, illicit tax, and so on. And I think we all recognize that's really, really important. The problem is, again, when we were talking earlier about sort of what can be done quickly and what will take time. That doesn't mean that we choose between one or the other. It means that we have to go full speed on all of these options. Changing tax systems is very, very hard. And we've all been at it for a long time. And right now we are in the sort of big meetings around financing for development haven't yet made the breakthrough that we need. That doesn't mean it's not important. It remains important, but it's not going to solve our problems in 2022 or 2023. And that's why some of these proposals out there, like the International Finance Facility, like some of the others that have been mentioned here, we really need to think about what's feasible, what is close to market, what can we get done now? Because these children out there, like Justin said, they're not waiting for us to fix tax systems. They will be already adults by the time maybe their governments manage to address that. So it's important for the future, very, very, very important. We need to put all our efforts behind that. But in the immediate term, we need to have solutions as well. And that's why replenishing GPE and having other solutions that can be done quickly are really important.
I'm delighted that you addressed that, Liesbet, because probably about a third of the questions in the chat box we're asking about the ways in which we can increase the revenue side, right, rather than the expense allocation, if you like. Suzanne, thank you very much for bringing up the community of practice. I see that we had over 100 participants on this call. Delighted that there is such interest in this topic. Suzanne had mentioned a little bit about a community of practice which is being set up about trying to attract private sector investment into education. Effectively, there's three objectives of this. It's to improve the collaboration and dialogue within the sector. And this is talking about all sorts of potential actors in this space, whether they be public, private finances, education implementers, and other interested parties, to strengthen the evidence base of the sector and to build sustained linkages amongst these key stakeholders so that we can effectively, practically try to crowd in some increased funding into this underfunded sector. And so if you would like to join this community of practice, it's an invitation to everyone on the call. Please feel free to send through your details either to Katie, as Suzanne has put into the box. Otherwise, please feel free to direct the messages to me and I'll make sure that gets to the right place. And so with that, I would just like to thank everyone, the 100 participants for joining the call today, as well as to Liesbet, Justin, Suzanne, and Scott for taking the time out. I realize it's a busy week of educational programming with the GPE Summit. And so thank you everyone for your time in this important call and look forward to engaging on the topic going forward.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Nice to see you all.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Everyone, bye.